Carrying legally can now get you killed. That's the quiet rule change hiding inside the Alex Pretty shooting. On paper, nothing changed. The Second Amendment still exists. Carry permits are still valid. Self-defense is still legal. But in practice, the moment shots were fired in Minneapolis, a contradiction snapped into place. Fact: federal officials framed Pretty's possession of an extra magazine as evidence of nefarious intent. Inference: preparedness itself is now being treated as aggression. And here's why this isn't about him. It's about you. Because if intent can be reconstructed after the fact, then legality stops mattering once law enforcement shows up. The gear you carry, the choices you make before anything happens, all of it can be reinterpreted once the outcome is already decided. The administration says this was about safety, but notice what they didn't say. They didn't say Pretty broke the law. They didn't say the equipment was illegal. Instead, they shifted the standard itself. This is where the story flips. Because once preparedness becomes suspicious, every armed citizen becomes a problem to be managed, not a right to be respected. And that raises one question the White House doesn't want asked yet. What exactly changed the moment Alex Pretty died? What happened in Minneapolis is being framed as a single encounter. One man, one moment, one decision. But that framing is doing a lot of work. Fact: the administration moved quickly to define the event around Alex Pretty's equipment, not his actions. The conversation shifted almost immediately to what he was carrying, how much of it, and what that supposedly said about his intent. Inference: this wasn't treated as an isolated shooting, but as a test case. Because this pattern is familiar. When the facts are messy or incomplete, the narrative fills the gap. Officials didn't wait for a full accounting. They didn't slow the message. Instead, they narrowed it. Pretty wasn't discussed as a citizen in motion. He was reduced to a set of objects, each one framed as suspicious. Here's the reframing question that matters. If lawful equipment can be used to assign motive after death, what is the standard being applied before anyone ever pulls a trigger? And more importantly, who gets to decide when preparedness crosses an invisible line? Now watch how fast this escalates, because once that line exists, it doesn't stay in Minneapolis. The claim being made is simple and dangerous, that what Alex Pretty carried mattered more than what he did. Fact: federal officials publicly emphasized his extra magazine, repeating the phrase nefarious intent as justification. That detail wasn't incidental, it was central. The equipment became the story. And that matters because magazines don't act on their own. They don't threaten anyone. They don't make decisions. Yet in this case, an object was elevated into motive. Inference: intent was assigned retroactively after the outcome was irreversible. Here's why that detail changes everything. If gear equals intent, then intent no longer needs to be proven. It only needs to be suggested. Once that suggestion is accepted, lethal force becomes easier to defend because the threat is no longer what happened in the moment, but what could have happened. Notice what's missing from the official framing. There is no emphasis on Pretty firing first, no clear claim that he violated the law, no statement that the equipment was illegal. Instead, the justification leans on implication, on how it looked, on how it might be interpreted. This is where the precedent quietly forms. Because when justification is built on implication instead of action, the standard shifts from behavior to perception, and perception is infinitely flexible. Now watch how that logic spreads beyond this one shooting. What makes this moment different is how quickly that logic was normalized. There was no pause, no hesitation. Fact: cabinet-level officials moved in sync, pushing the same framing across media appearances, treating the interpretation as settled before the public even understood the timeline. What should have been questioned became assumed. This kind of escalation isn't new, but it's rarely this explicit. In past controversies, justification usually came wrapped in distance and delay. Here, it came immediately. The implication was clear. Once an armed citizen enters a law enforcement encounter, the margin for survival collapses. Inference: the presence of a firearm doesn't just raise risk, it resolves it. Here's the unsettling part. This framing treats lethal force not as a last resort, but as a foreseeable outcome, something baked into the interaction itself. The abnormal becomes routine, the extraordinary becomes policy by repetition. And notice how calm the language was. No emergency declarations, no visible panic, just steady official tones explaining why this result made sense. That's how normalization works. Not through shock, but through reassurance. This is where the story stops being about a single shooting and starts looking like a system testing its boundaries. Because once something is explained calmly enough times, it stops sounding controversial at all. And that sets the stage for the next layer, where words and actions begin to collide. Do you want me to continue to the next part? The contradiction becomes impossible to ignore once you listen to what officials said versus what their argument requires. Fact. The administration publicly champions gun rights and lawful carry. At the same time, in the Pretty case, they argued that approaching law enforcement while armed creates a high likelihood officers are legally justified in shooting you. Those two positions cannot coexist. Here's the line that permanently changes how this story lands. If lawful carry increases the likelihood of justified lethal force, then the right exists only in theory, not in practice. Inference. The Second Amendment survives on paper, but collapses at the moment it's exercised in public. Notice the gap between words and consequences. Citizens are told they may carry, they follow the rules, they obtain permits, but once an interaction begins, those same facts are recast as risk factors. Not mistakes, not violations, risk factors. And risk factors, by definition, don't require wrongdoing. This is where the logic turns circular. You're allowed to carry, but carrying makes you dangerous. You're dangerous because you're carrying. And because you're dangerous, lethal force becomes reasonable. The conclusion is baked in before the encounter even unfolds. Here's why that matters beyond this case. Once that reasoning is accepted, legality no longer protects you. It merely documents you. And documentation doesn't stop a trigger pull. Now ask yourself how fast that logic can spread once it's officially spoken out loud. The pressure didn't build slowly, it stacked all at once. Fact. The narrative hardened before alternative explanations could breathe. At the same time, officials were defending the shooting. Reports surfaced suggesting a Good Samaritan context. Then came the aggressive media defense. Then came the legal framing that centered officer justification, not citizen conduct. 3 moves back to back, no space in between. This is what loss of control looks like in real time. Not chaos, but acceleration. Each development narrowed the story further, compressing it into a single acceptable conclusion. Inference. The faster the stack, the harder it becomes to unwind, even if contradictory facts emerge later. Here's the microcrisis hiding inside that speed. Once the narrative locks, any deviation becomes dangerous. A dead man can't correct the record. Witnesses get filtered through the frame already set, and public attention moves on before accountability ever has a chance to form. But here's the question nobody wants to sit with. What happens if this continues? If every armed interaction is resolved the same way, with justification assembled after the fact, then the outcome stops being exceptional. It becomes expected. And once outcomes become expected, behavior changes on both sides of the encounter. That's where the real damage begins. Now bring it back to where this actually lands. On you. Not in court filings or press briefings, but in ordinary life. Fact. The message coming out of this case is that lawful carry can be reframed as provocation. That changes how people move, think, and decide in real situations. Inference. The risk isn't abstract anymore, it's personal. Imagine the calculation. You're legally armed, you're doing nothing wrong, but you know that if law enforcement enters the picture, your compliance doesn't reset the risk. Your existence does. The object you're allowed to carry becomes the thing that redefines you in seconds. Not as a citizen, as a variable. This strips ideology out of the equation. It doesn't matter how you vote. It doesn't matter why you carry. The lived consequence is hesitation. Do you step forward to help? Do you intervene? Do you make yourself visible? Or do you disappear? Safety starts competing with survival in ways no law was supposed to force. Here's the quiet psychological impact. People don't get angry first. They get cautious. They withdraw. They stop engaging. And when that happens at scale, communities don't become safer. They become thinner, more distant, more afraid. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. because recognition is usually the first sign that something systemic is shifting. What allows this to happen isn't confusion, it's structure. Fact, the administration defended its agents while maintaining rhetorical support for gun rights. That balance isn't accidental, it's a mechanism. Inference. The system is designed to preserve authority first, principles second. Here's how it works. Executive power is incentivized to avoid visible failure. A mistake by an agent threatens legitimacy, so the response isn't to slow down and investigate. It's to stabilize the narrative as fast as possible. Equipment becomes intent. Intent becomes justification. Justification becomes closure. This is why outrage alone never sticks. The system doesn't run on morality. It runs on incentives. Agencies protect their own. Political leaders protect the agencies. And voters are expected to sort out the contradiction later, long after the moment has passed. Here's the unsettling insight mainstream coverage misses. Rights don't usually disappear through repeal. They erode through exception, each case framed as unique, each justification framed as reasonable, until the pattern is obvious, and by then it's already normal. This isn't about one administration or one city. It's about how power behaves when it's challenged by unpredictability. And armed citizens, by definition, are unpredictable. Once you see that mechanism, the next move becomes easier to anticipate, because systems like this don't reverse themselves. They either entrench or they collide with resistance. From here, the trajectory splits, but neither path is calm. Fact, the administration has doubled down on its framing, signaling confidence that the political cost will be contained. That creates one possible path. The standard hardens. Lawful carry remains legal in theory, while in practice, every armed interaction carries an assumed escalation. Over time, people adapt quietly, fewer intervene, fewer step forward. The rule doesn't need to be written, it's understood. But there's another path forming underneath that surface. Inference, trust erosion doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up as disengagement, missed votes, muted enthusiasm, support that looks solid on paper but disappears on election day. Not rebellion, absence. This is where uncertainty does real work. The White House may believe judicial wins and past loyalty are enough to absorb the shock, but momentum isn't static. It shifts based on how often people feel betrayed versus protected. And right now, that balance is unstable. Here's the key detail. Neither outcome requires a dramatic confrontation. Both unfold slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, and by the time the consequences are obvious, the next move has already been made, because politics, like power, doesn't wait for clarity. It moves on perception, and that perception is still forming. There's one insight that ties all of this together. The Alex Pretty case isn't about whether gun rights exist, it's about when they stop protecting you. Fact, nothing in this story required a new law, no vote, no repeal, just a shift in how intent is described after someone is already dead. Inference. The most consequential changes now happen at the narrative level, not the legislative one. Reframe the entire story this way. A right that only exists until it's exercised isn't a safeguard, it's a liability. And once that realization settles in, behavior changes faster than policy ever could. This is why the stakes here extend beyond Minneapolis. If preparedness can be reclassified as threat, then every future encounter inherits that logic. Quietly, automatically, without announcement. The question going forward isn't whether this standard will be challenged, it's where the next test happens and who's standing there when it does. Because this story doesn't really end with Alex Pretty. It ends when enough people recognize the pattern forming in front of them. And if you want to understand how deep that pattern goes, this analysis doesn't stop here. Follow for what comes next.